We're live. Welcome to Survive the Jive. It's Jive Talk. It's an AMA. I'm back after a whole year of no AMAs. I didn't realize it'd been so long. But some people probably have some questions they'd like to ask me. And I'm only going to do this for an hour, so I can't hang around flapping my lips. I'm going to crack on with all the questions I've got to get through. But I'll just say, before anyone wants to know, my second child was born in January, healthy and whole. I'm very happy. I'm very tired. My wife and I have been struggling with the toddler and the baby during this time. I still managed to get the Shivik documentary done, even though I was meant to be on paternity leave. But, the world doesn't stop. People need their Survive the Jive content, so I keep working. But yeah, I'm fine, but a bit sleep deprived. So, without further ado, let's crack on with the questions. I'll begin with my top patron, Liquid Oxygens, because he's got a whole bunch of them and I've got to get through them quick to get to the other questions. By the way, there's a hierarchy of questions. First, I answer all the patron questions that have been sent in advance of the stream. Then I'll answer all the Superchats. And then if there's time, I'll answer other people's questions in the chat. So, he asks, have you ever heard of the Scottish pork taboo? Any thoughts on where it came from? Yes, I've heard of it. It's in the 18th century mainly. It was a short amount of time. Parts of Scotland didn't eat pork. I don't know anyone conclusively says why. Some people did think it was due to an ancient prohibition, but I don't believe it was. There's no evidence for that. It only appears to have been for a brief period in the 18th century when people were ultra Protestant. And I think it actually comes from that, because on the Hebrides as well, some of the Hebridean islands, people were also not eating eel as well as pork, and both of these are prohibited in Deuteronomy. So I think it was part of the whole 18th century thing of everyone trying to be like the Jews, and a lot of Scottish people started thinking they were Jews, and it probably related to the fact that circumcision became common in Scotland in the 18th century too. But even by 1800, the Scots had stopped all that nonsense and were eating pork and not mutilating their children's penises anymore. America has continued that tradition. 2, can you talk about cattle herding a bit? Well, I've already spoken to you a lot about that. I've exhausted pretty much all my knowledge of it, so there's not much more I can say. But cattle herding is an ancient, about 9,000-year-old site in Anatolia. And is it related to our European ancestors, the first farmers who came from Anatolia into Europe some 8,000 years ago? Possibly. It's certainly true that our ancestors who left Anatolia at that time would have been culturally related to the people who made cattle herding if they weren't themselves the people who made it. What tenets, doctrines, or aspects of Buddhism do you most agree with? It's a bit too big a question for when I've got so many to get through. And what do you disagree with? Well, I think, I think the idea of samsara as like ultimately something you need to escape goes against Indo-European religion, which is all about like getting a good reincarnation, rather than not reincarnating. But there are some good things about it, like the meditative practices and the general like code of conduct for like behavior. It's okay. I can't go too further in that. The so-called Oseberg Buddha bucket is not anything to do with Buddha. It's just called that because he's in that pose. It's a Christian artifact from Ireland. On June 10th, 2017, I did a video on Proto-Indo-Europeans. How have my views changed since then? I'll go through the other questions that are related to it. Question 5. Do I associate Proto-Indo-Europeans with Sredni Stog? Yes, Sredni Stog is, in my opinion, the Proto-Indo-European culture. What was their way of life like? It was a pastoralist way of life. They may not have ridden horses, but they appear to have some horse tack. There's evidence that they bridled their horses, even if they didn't ride them. They probably milked the horses, and military helicopters going past, by the way, so you may hear that at the moment, rumbling my house. Flying supplies to Ukraine or whatever they're doing. they would have some kind of steppe pastoralist lifestyle, drinking milk from a horse and eating cheese and keeping cows and sheep, probably more sheep than cows actually, and worshipping a pantheon of deities that are ancestral to our gods. Can you comment on the level of agrarianism that would have been practiced by Proto-Indo-Europeans of the shedding stock? Professor Ken Dowden says they would have had towns, and you think that they could have been mixtures of transhuman and nomadic and more settled. Yeah, I'd say it's fair to say there was probably a mixture of different types. There were probably some people who were a bit more settled, like some settlements, but I don't think there would be anything like a town, really, like maybe some trading posts, you know what I mean? The neighbouring cultures in the Balkans and in parts of Romania would have been more settled, and they would have had contact with them, so they would have been aware of that way of life, and they probably had a few crops as well, but I don't think it would have made up a great amount of their diet. They would also have had plenty of contact to their east with hunter-gatherer peoples who weren't pastoralist at all, so there was a quite diverse sort of array of lifestyles in that part of the world. Can you comment on some of the Near Eastern influences on Homer, which you mentioned? I mentioned in private. Yes, I didn't say actually that I believe that there are Near Eastern influences on Homer. What I said is that they can't be dismissed, and I was referring to Mary Bakhvarova, who has convincingly argued, if you look up some of her lectures, Mary Bakhvarova, a classicist, who has pointed out the very clear parallels between some Near Eastern myths, the Hittites and other cultures, with content from Homer's writing. And her arguments, she uses examples of the actual trading networks and cultural interchange between Greece and the Near East, which did occur as evidence for the likelihood of cultural transmission as well. But I don't consider that the Homer's writings are necessarily of Near Eastern origin, but certainly I agree with her that the Near Eastern Anatolian cultures would have had their own stories of the Trojan War, which would have had some relation to those that Homer told, and it's possible that versions of the stories told on either side of the Aegean influence each other. That's all. I won't go any further than that with her theories. I got a super chat from Mr. Tom Flan. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Cheers, Tom. Any chance of a big corded ware video like the Yamnai one? Thanks. Maybe. I don't know, really, to be honest. I thought about it, but not sure what to say, because a lot of it's sort of like the same stuff. It's like the same video. Like the corded ware aren't really very, very different from Yamnai culturally or physically. They really look the same. They would have looked the same, and they would have been pretty much culturally the same. So it's pretty much the same people. So it's a little bit like just going over the same ground. But I might do, maybe. I don't know. I don't feel very motivated to, because I don't feel like I don't like to repeat myself, and I just don't feel like there's much I haven't said about corded ware in that respect. Like, what's important about corded ware is that they are the actual Proto-Indo-Europeans who actually spread Indo-European, made it a big deal in the world. If it wasn't for corded ware, no one would even be talking about Indo-Europeans. It would be like a pretty insignificant language group. The question from user number 3A584923. Catchy. Have you ever heard about the Veneti people? Yes, I have. I don't know a lot about them. I haven't studied them in detail. The Veneti people are an Indo-European people from the Adriatic, northeast Italy kind of area, who lived in the first millennium BC. And they were theorized by ancient writers to have originated in Anatolia, but there's no evidence to support that. The linguistic evidence of their names that have survived, it shows it is an Indo-European language they spoke there, and it seems to be mostly closely related to Celtic and Germanic languages and Italic languages, which would mean it probably isn't an Anatolian language in that case. It would be more likely to be something from Central Europe relating to the Belgica culture in that case. But there's never been a genetic study to prove either way, so I don't know. And I'm no expert on Veneti people. Now, let me go to the next load of questions on Patreon. Bard asks, what do you think about the idea of the Dragon Slayer myth originating with the ancient North Eurasians? Siberians and Amerindians have myths that match that motif deeply. Gives the example of the Iroquois myth of Hinnon the Thunderer spirit who fights Oniare, the horned serpent, to free maidens. That's quite compelling. Certainly, you've got the elements there of a thunder god, a god associated with thunder, having to fight a serpent who is associated with water, and to rescue a female. It's all there, except that the club, of course, isn't there. But maybe the club is something that was added by Indo-Europeans. But yeah, I think that's possible. The Dragon Slayer myth could come from ancient North Eurasians. There is still in my mind a bit of a problem about explaining the reason for the Dragon Slayer myth existing in the Mesopotamia. Because there's some clear parallels to Indo-European Dragon Slayer in Mesopotamia, and there's no clear evidence for transmission from the Indo-Europeans to Mesopotamia or from Mesopotamia to the Indo-Europeans. There's no clear evidence, but there must be some way to explain it eventually. But it might be that just that, like the common ancient North Eurasian heritage spread it around, which is fantastic to imagine if that's the case. But speculative, so let's not dwell on speculation anymore. Speculation is just speculation. Gary Macmillan, my question is about pagan ceremony. I listened to Edward Dutton. He saw a ritual in Finland and he said it looked like LARPing. I saw a ceremony and it looked very much like kids might play it being wizards. To me, it did not. It looked like it lacked solemnity. I felt it looked like LARPing. Do you think pagans need to make our rituals and practices look more solemn to improve the perception of our ceremonies and beliefs? So just to clarify, LARPing means live action role playing, and it's when you it's a game that some people play. I've never seen it done, but it's a kind of a game where you like you play role play. It's a role playing game, and you play live action, and it's often medieval fantasy, which is why people try to connect it to modern paganism, because they think it's like a connection to medieval. So in what way is it like LARPing? You didn't actually mention what about it was like, what LARPing or whatever, but I guess in LARPing you can play as a wizard. It's one of the things you could be. So what is the reason that LARPing exists? Obviously people play those LARPing games because they find them to be fun and they're a form of escapism because they're not content with this modern world. And they go instead to a fantasy imagined world based on medieval Europe. That tells us a lot, doesn't it, about the failures of the modern world and about the things that people are actually looking for to make them feel happy. Obviously, there was something about that world that's appealing to people. The only consideration when conducting a ritual is to do it properly. The only people you need to impress, the only being that needs to be impressed by a ritual is the gods. If you are trying to make the ritual look better to other humans, then you are not being sincere. It's funny, you're talking about it needs to be more sincere, but if you say you're worried about like making it appeal to humans, then it's not really a pagan ritual, because pagan rituals aren't for humans, they're for the gods or for the ancestors, or whatever, or whatever being you're invoking. And if you're not comfortable doing that, you're not a pagan. If you've got a problem doing that, if you're the sacrificer, you're taking on the role of the sacrificer. So you are in live action taking on a role. We should do every day. If you're a father, you take on the role of a father. If you are, whatever your job is, you're taking on a role. So you're taking on roles all the time. As William Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage. In this, there is only one role that really matters, and that is the role of being pious to the gods. You participate in the original act of creation and are united with the gods themselves and all your ancestors by participating in the divine moment of the creation of the universe when you participate in ritual. If you're worried about anything else than that, if that's not satisfying enough for you, then you don't have even understood it. I don't understand what you're doing. Like, you don't know what paganism is. It's not about impressing people or like how it looks. It's got nothing to do with that. Costumes, I don't have costumes. We don't need costumes or anything. We don't have to dress up like people used to in the olden days. We wear a ritual robe maybe, as the colours become significant within a ritual context, but we don't have like historical clothing or anything like that. That's not part of it. So I don't like your question, to be honest. I don't think... I think you've got the wrong assumptions about the whole thing, about what religion's for. Joshua asks, "Hi Tom, congratulations to you and your family on the arrival of your child. Do you have any further thoughts on British DNA in Norway and the interaction between Britons and Gaels, for example?" Okay, so Britons and Gaels are two British insular peoples, not having to do with Norway. So I'm not sure what those two questions are. There's that one question. There's only one question mark, but it's like there's two questions. Were insular Celts, for instance, I think you mean were insular Celts, for instance, interested in more northern trade and explanation? Was it simply limited to wives and slaves for the Norse Vikings? I'm a little bit confused by that question and the phrasing there, but I'll tell you what I mentioned about the recent paper on Iron Age, 2,000 years of Scandinavian genetics. It's very interesting, and it shows that British and Irish DNA is pretty much non-existent in pre-Viking Scandinavia, although another study did find a little bit, which was very interesting, but this study didn't find any. So British and Irish DNA suddenly floods into Viking Age Scandinavia during the Viking Age. And it's not all over Scandinavia, it's mostly in certain parts, and it gradually diminishes during the medieval times, with the exception of in central Norway, where it persists for a bit longer in medieval times. Medieval Norwegians had a bit more British ancestry, British and Irish ancestry. But yeah, modern day Scandinavians are pretty much they have very little British ancestry. They've gone back to what they were like before Vikings, but the average Viking had more British DNA than the average modern day Scandinavian does, because of this influx of British and Irish DNA. Some of it would be from, I presume, from slaves, but I think a significant amount would be from naturalized Norsemen who integrated with the Irish, for example, or with the inhabitants of the Northern Ireland, like the Orkneys and the Hebrides, or Anglo-Saxons, and who then came back, and they wouldn't have been regarded as British or Irish. They would have just been regarded as Norsemen, but they would have had some British or Irish ancestry when they came back, and that's probably how it got there. That's pretty much all I have to say on the matter. Dominique asks, thoughts on southern Italy and the genetic and cultural impact the Germanic Lombards had on the region, as many people still believe that only the north of Italy had a cultural and genetic impact. Yet history shows that after the Franks conquered the Lombard lands in northern Italy in the year 774, the Lombards mainly fled to the south, where there was some level of independence under the Duchy of Benevento. As time grew on, many Lombards flocked to the south, and up until the Norman conquest of the south of Italy, the people known there were called Lombards still, and even the Byzantines named a theme after them in the south called the Theme of Langobardia. As I've read substantially on this, and also having my family history from Puglia in the southeast of Italy, I've always wanted to ask someone for a genetic take. I may also add that everyone I know in southern Italy has blonde hair and light eyes and a pale complexion. And when I put my father's DNA into G25 using the ancient results search, it comes back with an Italian sample, Foggia, as a closest genetic match, which I believe to be a Northern European match. No, it's an Italian match, but not entirely sure if that may come from the Lombards. Thanks, and sorry. Okay. Basically, the Lombards did not leave a significant genetic impact anywhere in Italy. The evidence is that there was a huge Middle Eastern influx into Italy during the Imperial Roman era, as I just said in the stream on that subject. And then this gradually, in the cities especially, but gradually the rural populations who have more children repopulated Italy, and the urban populations who were very Middle Eastern started to diminish, and gradually over time Italy became Italian again, more Italian, as it had been during the Roman Republic. There was also a massive influx in medieval times of Nordic DNA and other European, more like northern DNA from people like the Lombards. The Lombards were genetically the same as Swedes, pretty much, from what the Lombard cemetery DNA has shown. They weren't very great in number. They didn't mix very much at first. They stayed as a separate caste of Nordic people in Italy, ruling over the Italian populace. But eventually they must have mixed, and when they mixed out of existence. And they weren't significant enough in numbers to have left a very great impact anywhere in Italy. The least Nordic part of Italy is the south. The southern part of Italy is very different from the rest of Europe. It's the 50% of all the variation genetically in Europe occurs within Italy. You can see it from the north to the south of Italy. And the southern Italians have a genetic affinity with the Greeks. They're not particularly... there's no Nordic affinity that I would notice genetically. Maybe you could be detected by someone who knows what they're doing. I don't know how to do that, but it's not there. It's not very obvious when you look at the PCA. They're clearly very, very distinct from any Nordic populations. As for your friends all having blonde hair and blue eyes, that isn't a measure of Nordic ancestry. I've said this many times that you can't use phenotype to determine that. It's just not a way that you can do that reliably at all, because blonde hair and blue eyes exist all over Europe, regardless of the presence of Scandinavian people in varying frequencies. And it's not a measure of Nordic ancestry at all. John asks, can you talk about the difference in Indo-European migrations that resulted in the Greeks and Romans versus Germanic and Celtic tribes? Well, first off, you've got the wrong idea lumping Greeks and Romans together separate from Germanic and Celtic, because the Romans and the Germans and the Celts all derive from corded ware culture via bell beaker to some extent. Celtic is bell beaker mixed with corded ware. Bell beaker comes from corded ware. Celtic comes from, as I said in the Celtic video, a mixture of bell beaker mixing with going back and mixing with other corded ware of the Unitica culture and making a new culture in Central Europe. And that weird going on in Central Europe that created the Celts is also probably what caused the Italic people to come into existence before they invaded Italy. And the Germanics are a similar complicated mixture of bell beakers back migrating and mixing again with corded ware. The Greeks come from the catacomb culture, which derives from the Yamnaya culture. So they're very different in their origins in that sense. Although, as I said at the beginning of the stream, the corded ware and the Yamnaya people are pretty much the same genetically. It's the same race. But culturally different, because the corded ware were more northerly and had more adaptations for a northern climate with more trees. Is there a reason why they were culturally so different if they both came from Bronze Age migrations of I tribe? Well, I mean, I don't think they were that different originally. The early Proto-Greeks and the Proto-Italics would have been, very similar to other, Indo-European tribes. If you mean why the Greeks and Romans became heavily urbanized. Well, that's because of Near Eastern, influences and like general Mediterranean culture, which has nothing to do with Indo-Europeans, of like urbanism and that kind and sea trade and things like that. Antonio Lalo asks, "Hi Tom, do you consider the cult of Dionysus to be Indo-European?" Yeah, I do. Yeah. Does it exist a similar ecstatic cult in Norse religion? Possibly. My old personal tutor at university believed that the cult of Yngwie Frey was like a Bacchic cult. I'm not sure I agree with that though, but it's probably something similar. There was probably some kind of similar thing to Dionysus in Germanic religion too. In fact, the cult of Odin, I think, could have like Dionysian elements in it, for sure. Jackson Callahan asks, "I'd like to know of the difference between haplogroup R1L20 and R1BL21 and their origins. I just can't seem to find much on it. Also, I love your work and thank you all for all you do." They both come from Belgica people, and they're both in Britain, associated now with Celtic language speakers. The R1BL21 definitely predates the Celts, though. It came into Britain with Belgica people who were pre-Celtic speaking. So there would have been earlier Indo-Europeans arriving around 2400 BC, whereas the Celts would have arrived around 1000 BC. I think it's possible R1BL20 might have arrived later with that Celtic migration, but I don't know. I can't remember, to be honest. But yeah, both of them today are associated with the insular Celtic language speakers, and they both ultimately derive from Belgica people. But whether they both derive from the initial British Belgicas, or whether one of them came in with a later migration, I don't know. Do you think? Oh, KW asks, "Do you think pagans should exclusively adhere to the pantheon and traditions associated with their ethnicity and heritage?" I think that's a good start. It's definitely a good start. You should begin with what is. You can't really like honor your ancestors properly if you deny your heritage. If so, is there any hope for European descendants across the New World who may have mixed ancestry from divergent European cultures? Yes, because they can still just choose the one that's most relevant to them. Adrian Bai, thanks so much for doing this AMA. It seems like a lot of the foundations of Chinese culture come from Europeans or Indo-Europeans, sometimes via India. These are some of the topics I have found so far. Many are from Xinjiang, which is politically sensitive for China. Buddhism, terracotta army inspired by Greeks. Taoism parallels with Hinduism. Old Chinese may be Indo-European. Chariots, pottery from Yangshao culture. The yin-yang symbol first appeared in the Notatia Dignatum of the Roman Empire, 700 years before China. What do you think of this list? I think that those things are not related to each other, and they're thousands of years apart sometimes. So it like chariots and Buddhism, like you're talking like a big. There has been an influence on China from the West, yes, but all these things are not one thing. They're like all completely separate, unrelated events, and trying to like lump them all into one thing doesn't really help you understand anything. Like lumping like the Roman yin-yang symbol. The fact that Romans had yin-yang before China means maybe the Chinese took it from Romans. We don't know that for sure, but maybe. But that doesn't have anything to do with like the fact that chariots were invented by Indo-Europeans and spread to China thousands of years earlier. It doesn't really help you understand either of those phenomena to just group it into one thing. And like to try and say, what are you trying to say? Like Chinese culture is European? Because it isn't. It isn't European. So I don't think that. So I don't know what exactly you're trying to say. Like the Chinese culture had at various times influence from the West? Absolutely. Does the Chinese culture derive entirely from the Europeans? No, it doesn't. It has they're an ancient civilization that predates the influences of Indo-Europeans anyway. They were already a civilization before that. Like, one of the things you didn't mention that is quite likely and interesting is that Indo-Europeans had an influence on the development of metallurgy in China. But it's still not even true to say that Indo-Europeans introduced metallurgy to China, because the Chinese had metallurgy already before Indo-European contact. But it does seem like there may have been some influence of them on the way that they used metal, because Western and Eastern techniques of metallurgy were quite different. So, like, they went in different directions. Chinese generally favored casts, whereas like in the West there was more crude, you could say, forging and hammering techniques and things. Anyway, the chariot definitely comes from Indo-Europeans. That's one thing they took. Obviously, people from India brought some aspects of some Buddhism and stuff, but also not just India directly, because it's not just Indian people who brought Buddhism to China, but other Indo-European peoples like the Tocharians were possibly influential, and Iranic peoples who, before Zoroastrianism, a lot of Iranic peoples on the steppe were Buddhist. So they may have been instrumental in introducing Buddhism to China as well. Not just Indian people, although Buddhism originates in India. So, it's an interesting thing to talk about. I sent you a link of about the Old Chinese linguistic stuff about Indo-European influences on Old Chinese, but I don't think it's correct to say Old Chinese is Indo-European. That's not right. Lots of interesting things there, but I don't like it when just don't go too far, because it sounds like a bit weird. It sounds like you're trying to claim Chinese culture as your own or something, like, or say, it comes from us when it doesn't. But it's definitely true that there have been cross-cultural influences. Of course, that's hardly surprising. Now, I've done them all. I've done all the questions that were sent in advance. Tom Flan sends... Oh no, that's why I've done that one. Okay, no more super chats? Psychopomp asks, do you have thoughts on whether Odin is the European equivalent of Shiva or Indra? There are certainly clear elements of Odin as the Menaban god of like the graveyard, that's equivalent to Shiva, and they're also, as a sky father, he's equivalent to Indra in the Rig Veda. But you're talking about two different, very dynamic and changing religions, and the idea that there's a one-for-one. I've said this many times, but I keep saying it in my streams, that you come the cropper if you keep thinking like it has to be one or the other. Is Odin one or the other? Like, I always say Odin is very, very equivalent to Brahaspati, because he's the priest of the gods, and he demonstrates, like, for mankind, he like mediates between like the divine and mankind in a way that is very Odinic, but that doesn't mean that the parallels to Shiva aren't there or Indra aren't there, because if you look at how comparative mythology works, you're not trying to find equivalents for gods, you're trying to find equivalents for mythic tropes. So you find a mythic trope or a function, like a Dumascenian function, and then you find an equivalent the function of that god. So does this function of Odin exist in this god? Yes. But also this other function of Odin exists in this god. So you see, that's how you do comparative mythology, really. Not say like Odin is Indra or something like that, because that's reductive. Joshua Phillips sends $100. Thank you very much, Joshua. That's very kind. much appreciated. It's great to get. Thank you, all my patrons. I take this opportunity to thank you so much to all my patrons who support this channel, because even though it's growing and growing and growing, the patronage isn't actually. That's kind of like plateaued for a few years. But it's not because I've got the same guys. Like, I lose, like, every month, like, dozens, but I gain dozens. So it's like, but it always stays around the same way, which is interesting phenomenon. But I did project in 2019 when I started doing this that I would get growth, because I thought as the channel grows, there'll be a corresponding increase in patrons. But that hasn't occurred, surprisingly. So I really am grateful for everyone who does support me. Rigveda Indra is like Thor, says Orion. Yes, Rigveda Indra is like Thor in the sense he's like a thunderer, but he's also a sky father. He's the king of heaven, and Thor is not the king of anything. Thor is not the ultimate sovereign, is he? So, yeah, he has elements of. Indra is like Thor, very much so, in some ways. And I think that's the most obvious parallel to make. Later, Indra becomes less regal, less, superior in other texts. How likely is it that Bronze Age Scandinavian mercenaries fought in the Trojan War? I don't know how likely it is, but it is possible. It's certainly likely that mercenaries from the steppe, I think it's more likely that mercenaries from the steppe, like, who would be much closer. Like, if they're going to have barbarians from the north, the closest, you go straight north of the Balkans, the other side of the Black Sea, you've got, like, barbarians on the steppe, like Scythians or whatever. I think they're going to be there. So I'd be expecting to see Scythians or Scythians, probably more likely. And I've always wondered, why is it that when you look at like depictions of the Trojan War on Greek vases and things, that the Trojans are wearing Scythian attire, or like that same kind of clothing associated with the Scythians. So there must have been some kind of cross-cultural exchange between the steppe and Anatolia that led to the same kind of clothing being associated with the two regions by the Greeks. So which I'm talking about long-sleeved, tight garments, trousers, which Greeks didn't wear, obviously, and Phrygian caps. Of course, Phrygian caps are named after the Phrygians, who are an Anatolian people, but I think Eurigenes has convincingly argued that the Phrygians migrated from through the Bosphorus from the Balkans somewhere, and so it's quite possible, because you see that kind of hat associated with the Thracians as well and Balkan peoples, and that would explain why you see that similar hat in the Scythians. Like, this hat could have been an ancient Indo-European thing, or it could have been a later development in the Iron Age that just was common to the Balkans, the steppe, and the Anatolian peoples. I think it's really interesting. I just haven't seen anyone talk about it at length, but if anyone recommends a text that would reveal more on that, I'd be very interested to see it. Are you related to Wolf Alice's singer Ellie Rousel? I would guess I am. I contacted her before she was famous, when they were like just a very small indie band, because I just heard someone called Rousel, and she didn't respond. So there's certainly no chance of her responding now that she's famous. But from what I understand, she was born in London, and the Rousel Londons are my Londons, my Rousels. So she's probably from, like, there's a larger Rousel, like the Rousel family name originates in the West Country in Somerset, but there was a smaller group of Rousels, and some from Somerset. Some went to Canada, and there's a whole load of Canadian Rousels who I'm not closely related to, much in common with them. But there was a smaller group of Rousels who went to London around 1700, and pretty much all the famous Rousels have all come from them. And all the Australian Rousels come from them, and most of like the famous Rousels in Britain, including Frederick Rousel, who was the director, the governor of part of Egypt, and like Sarah Rousel, who laid the first stone of the Houses of Parliament today by Big Ben. Lots of them, like, these are all the London Rousels. And she comes from London, so maybe she's one of mine, but she doesn't want to be associated with me. So I'll denounce her. I extricate her from the Rousel clan. Ryan says we need to bring the Indo-European hat back in style. Did it ever go out of style? Did it ever go out of style? I didn't know. Advice for people who want to practice their native faiths as faithfully as possible but find it hard to do so. Do New Age influence from Wicca and occultists who claim to be pagan. I don't understand how that would affect you. Like, just do it. Just do it. Just pray to the gods. I mean, I don't understand how Wiccans can stop you or occultists can stop you. Just do it. People make it way more complicated than it needs to be. Yes, I mean, there is a lot of complicated stuff. There's a lot of stuff to learn and read. But really, like, it just starts with praying. Just do it. There's nothing stopping you. As soon as the stream stops, you can start praying. Thank you very much, ESMD, for the generous $100 donation. Wow. Congratulations, I've enjoyed your work for years. It pushed me on a path of pilgrimage and discovery. Wow. That's fantastic. I'm so glad to hear. I wonder what pilgrimages you went on. I always say to people, pilgrimages can be really important. Like, some people, always talk about like how psychoactive hallucinogens can be like a trigger to help people become religious. But you know what? A pilgrimage can do it. Sometimes you've got to do a difficult journey. A journey of the body externally can help you with an internal journey. But you have to have the right mindset. Evela's work on mountain climbing is important to get the idea of that, because climbing a mountain doesn't do anything spiritually, but if you have the right mindset, the overcoming of the mountain is similar to like there can be a parallel ascendance of the spirit accompanying the mountain climb. I have been like doing these streams with like fantastic guests over the past year, and sometimes I don't get a single donation at all. But when I do an AMA now, I used to get lots of donations from AMAs, and now I do one again. I'm getting donations again. So it must be something about people only want to donate when there's an AMA. So I'm learning something here. But I don't know how many people, whether people enjoying my interviews with these people, because I found them really interesting people I've had on, but they haven't had a lot of views. So if you've missed any of them, check out this channel, the Jive Talk channel. There's a lot of interesting talks on here, like some guys I selected, like Scott Shell, very interesting chap, knows all about runes. He knows his runes really well. How do you personally feel after prayer and ritual? Better than before. Wotan Fury says, the shamanism one from here lately was one of my favourites. Thank you. That one wasn't actually a live interview. I went to Cornwall. I drove to Cornwall to interview this Danish guy, the shaman, Chris Lutekau. But I put it on this channel because I thought, I'm going to put all interviews on here. Originally, this channel was going to be all for live stuff, but then I started only doing interviews, and I thought I'll just put interviews on here whether they're live or not. If people still like AMAs, I should do more of them. I just thought that people weren't that. I didn't know people had so many questions to ask me. But Tom, do you know the European Council of Ethnic Religions? Asked Lorenzo. What do you think of it? I think it's good. Yes, I shared it on Telegram and I promoted it. I think it's cool. I emailed them and asked them if they wanted to work with me and they didn't respond. So that sucks, but they're doing good work, so fair play to them. They're not very big. They don't have as much influence as they could. But sometimes I know certain organizations, I won't say which, but like they have all the right ideas, but then if you approach them and try to teach them, like I'm someone with a background, like, you know, I've got experience in digital marketing and communications. I got a degree in communications. I've worked for the World Health Organization as a communications officer. I know how to do things properly, and they just don't want to hear it. They want to do things their way and speak to like 20 people at a time, which is, I don't understand why people are like that. Are you still in contact with your distant relation in Sri Lanka? Yes, I email occasionally. Yeah. In fact, you know, a really funny thing happened today. I got an email, not from him, but from the granddaughter of the brother of my ancestor who moved to Sri Lanka. And she sent me a photograph of that guy's wedding in Sri Lanka around 1900 with my great-great-grandfather present in Sri Lanka with his daughter, but not my great-grandfather who was absent for some reason. But it's like, you know, photos from 123 years ago are still just like appearing now. Some like nearly 80-year-old woman sent it to me. And isn't that funny? Like these things just like disappear. Someone took a photo in Sri Lanka 123 years ago. And then it comes to me only now by email. And it was probably in a drawer for all that time. It's just crazy to me. I love that, to get that. I put all that stuff. I have a separate blog about my family history called Rousel Family History, because I know like not everyone on Survivor Jive wants to hear about that stuff. But Wotan Fury asks, what's my view on Woden's role early on? I believe he was always the progenitor of the gods, with Tyr being more integral. Some say Woden was a later addition. I don't. I agree with you, and I did a whole stream on Tyr, a big one, where I covered all this, and I've already gone over it. And also, I did a video on the Skyfather where I said it too. So I've already said all this already, but no, Woden, all the evidence we have on Germanic mythology, all of it, from not just Norse mythology, not just like the Icelandic stuff, but like earlier stuff from, you know, from the continent and from England, all of it makes it very clear that the principal and chief god of the Germanic people is and has always been Woden. So I don't think there's any evidence for Tyr being the head Skyfather. It's possible. It's quite likely that Tyr derives from a Skyfather deity of the Indo-Europeans, who was at one point a chief deity, but never among Germanic people. Because Germanic people only start around, 500, 600, 700 BC or something. And I think by that time already Woden was their god. And that one of the main things of Woden is that he's a Menabund god. And this is probably explaining some of the expansion of the Germanic people and how they became dominant in Scandinavia and spread out in south to Germany and whatever. Because they have this god of the Menabund. So the wolf god, the war god, became the chief god for them. And then he assumed perhaps some roles that were associated with other gods previously. Any thoughts to share on the theory of pre-flood high civilization? What flood? There was no flood. Talking about flood. The Bible is fiction. Nexus, what are your main reasons for dismissing the Linda book? Linguistically, it's fake. Runes, fake. The religion in it, fake. Everything about it is fake. The man who made it is a liberal, and he was trying to make a liberal religion. It's a fake. Everything about it is fake. It does not correspond to anything in Indo-European comparative mythology. It's no linguist will tell you it's real. No runologist will tell you it's real. No manuscript expert will tell you it's real. No comparative mythologist will tell you it's real. Why would you want to believe it except if you're coping? You're trying to cope. There is literally no reason whatsoever. There's no evidence whatsoever that would ever give you a single reason to think it was true. There's nothing about it that's remotely realistic. God, Jord gives me a tenner. Thank you very much. Do you plan to make more videos about Slavic countries and Slavic peoples in general? No plan. No plan to do that at the moment. Yeah, Winkel says other sources mention it. Other Near Eastern sources. The Near Eastern flood had flood myths. The flood myth is not just the Bible, it's much older. It comes from old Semitic beliefs, and it influenced Greek myth because the Greeks adopted it and said Jupiter caused a flood or whatever. So and the Romans took it from the Greeks. The Romans later abandoned their own mythology and took a Greek mythology, and the Greek mythology had been influenced by Near Eastern philosophy. But you don't see any myths of like this grand flood of that sort. And don't tell me that the flood in Ragnarok is equivalent, because that's something that's projected in the future, and it doesn't talk about like, you know, a devastating thing in the past. It's something that's going to happen. The waters will overrun the land. That's not the same thing. Is an Englishman with I1 more likely to be of Anglo-Saxon or Viking descent? I think it's hard to say, but I don't know for sure. But I'm going to guess Viking, because I1 in the Germanic world is more higher frequency in Scandinavia than in Denmark. So the Anglo-Saxons would have had I1, but not in the same frequencies as the Vikings or the Normans. So I would imagine that it's statistically more likely that an Englishman with I1 would come from Viking or Norman lineage rather than Anglo-Saxon. Are there concrete Indo-European views on sexual morals? How would you compare it to Abrahamic views? I think that that's hard to say, because Indo-European morality only exists to us through comparative. So we can compare the morals of different ones and assume that there's a common origin of them. But yeah, I mean, generally they're pretty similar to the ancient Abrahamic ones when you're going back that far. Now, obviously, if you compare like pagan Indo-European religions to Abrahamic ones, they're very different. But the roots of Abrahamic religion are Semitic paganism, and then if you look at the morals of Semitic paganism, they're not really very different from early Indo-European morals in general. It's mostly about sacrificing is good, patriarchy is good, kill your enemies. Pretty much the same thing in every culture in the world, actually. Not really anything that unique in their morality. In fact, and also debatable whether you can even use the word morality. But yeah, certainly later on you get like a very divergent form of morality emerging with Judaism and post-temple Judaism, at least. Is there a name for the shared art style between Saxon artifacts at Sutton Hoo and the artifacts of Vendel era Sweden? Asked Kingdom of Vinland. Someone didn't watch my video on Celtic and Viking knotwork. You got to go and watch that right now. Yes, there is a name. That's Stalin Style 2. But you'll learn more than just what Stalin Style 2 is if you watch that video, and you'll see some incredible CGI animations by Rob Molyneux of the Norse mythological depictions on the Gothvorth cross. That's a really cool film, I say so myself, and it's a shame that you didn't see it. If you're interested in that art style, that video is all about knotwork art style of Germanic and Celtic people. Graham Hancock has unfortunately rotted many people's brains. Just terrible, terrible. How should I go about libations? I keep asking Wotan Fury, answering his questions. It's just I like his questions better. It's not that I don't want to answer other people's. And it's a good question. How should you go about libations? First, make sure that you invoke the deity with an appropriate epithet, and then you tell the deity what it is you're pouring for them and why. this libation, you should use adjectives like for the libation as well. The bright, like in the Rig Veda, it describes the soma as being bright or whatever, and it describes its process of its making, or like the kennings for mead as well describe it as being bright or sweet or whatever. So use those kennings to accentuate the value of the substance that's being poured, and use the epithets of the deity to emphasize the devotion you have for that deity and the value that you place in that deity, and then pour it. I think if you pour inside the house, you should have a fieli, as they say or a clout bowl, which clout would normally mean the blood that comes from a sacrificial beast, but in my opinion, a clout bowl fills the same role as a fieli, which is to catch the sacrificial liquid, whether it be the blood of a victim or a libation. So I pour from a horn or whatever your ritual vessel is, like a glass. It doesn't have to be a horn. It can be a glass, some kind of nice thing, a jug. It has to be a pretty nice vessel though, and you pour that into the bowl. Or if you're outside, you can pour it directly onto the floor at the foot of the idol. If you should have an idol. But that should get you started. Wow, I've enjoyed talking to you all. Sorry to everyone whose questions didn't get answered. You could always have sent a super chat and then you were guaranteed to get an answer. But this was popular, so I think I'll do another one at some point. To finish off for the night, I advise everyone, stop watching Graham Hancock, stop reading the Bible and believing in global floods. Okay, keep surviving the jive. Good night.